welcome you all to the April session of our Clinical Research Professional Training Series. My name is Karen Carter, and I work for the Center for Clinical and Translational Science here at The Ohio State University. Today, I'm going to be talking about enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. As you know, there has been a lot of discussions around enrolling a more diverse populations. The FDA issued a guidance in November of last year that I have referenced later in the presentation, entitled Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, and Trial Design Guidance for Industry. I would like to just make one short statement regarding guidances. When the FDA or NIH issue a guidance, these are not rules and regulations. These are insights into how they are viewing things. So the stuff that I'm going to be discussing today, it is not mandatory in order to do these things. These are suggestions that the FDA has developed for ways to increase the diversity of our study populations so that they better reflect the populations that the science is being applied to. So today's objectives are to understand the need for diverse populations, discuss some methods for modifying the inclusion-exclusion criteria and trial designs to increase this diversification, and then to identify some additional resources for you and for your investigators as to how to meet these guidances issued by the FDA. If you are also following along and the JTF competencies, these are the competencies that will be included in the discussion today if you're tracking that. So why is the diversity in our populations important? One, we have a very diverse population, global population. Here within the state of Ohio, we have quite a few various cultures. We have the Hispanic, we have the African American, we have Somali, we have quite a bit of Asian. And I was surprised to find that we've also got quite a few of the Native American populations also here within the central Ohio area. So in order to enroll in our studies to better reflect the population that we have, we need to be sure to diversify our enrollment so that the study results reflect all of those population individuals. The Belmont report, as all of you are aware, one of the 3 items is justice. Taking it straight from the Belmont report, justice is who ought to receive the benefits of research and bear its burdens. This is the question of justice in the sense of fairness in distribution or what is deserved. Study populations should reflect the patient population. One of the applications of research design is to make sure that you have included in your study those that will benefit from the study results, so that if you do not enroll certain populations, but those study results may apply to them, it's not an equal justice being served. Along those lines, making sure that you're fairly distributing the risks across populations so that one side is not bearing all the burdens but none of the benefits. Possible barriers that we encounter are the eligibility requirements, language issues. Do we have consents and study assessments in their native language? There's a lack of trust due to historical events This is a rather large one that we are currently facing, that there have been issues of misconduct in the past. And because of that, you have populations that do not wish to participate in research. And as recently identified, there are a lot of social and economic disparities um, across our populations that prevent them from participating in research. So let's look at some of these issues. I wanted to bring one example that I experienced early on in my clinical research career, and that I was working on a pediatric diabetic study, looking for biomarkers in the siblings and family members of a newly diagnosed type 1 patient. So these are pediatric patients who have been newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and that they're looking at siblings and family members who might also be at a higher risk. This was only looking at risk factors. And when I started looking back over a few years, I noticed that our enrollment did not match the distribution, the race and ethnicity distribution within Central Ohio. As you can see here, the distribution showed a higher incidence in the African American population at 17%, and the white was only 11%. There were some other ones listed. But what I found was that my enrollment was almost exclusively white. Very few of the Black or Hispanics were enrolling in the study. And so that was my first indication that the enrollment was not matching my race and ethnicity currently in my population that I was studying. I also went back in preparing for this and looked at the study site. And again, the distribution was not fair and not reflective of the actual um, incidence of type 1 diabetes in pediatric patients. So this is an indication that this study was not being diverse in their enrollment uh, procedures, and that some of their study was not reflective of across cultures. So broadening the eligibility requirements sometimes can be a method of increasing the diversity of your enrollment. Purpose of your inclusion exclusion criteria is so that you can have a very unvaried population, so that when you do your analysis, you don't have outliers. So you basically have your inclusion criteria that says this is how we're describing our disease. These are the things that they have to meet those requirements. And then also the exclusion criteria seeks to, one, um, exclude those that would be at a higher risk than others, such as if they had an underlying disease, such as kidney or something like that, that was contrary to the disease that you were studying. So comorbidities, that's why a lot of times you do uh, chemistries to make sure that um, their body is functioning properly. So these are the reasons that you have the inclusion exclusions. But sometimes the exclusion criteria are not really based on any strong clinical or justifiable scientific merit. It's just the easy way to do it. A lot of times you will see that um, the study requires them to speak English. Um, This is a way of making it easier on the study population not to have translations, not to have translators available. It makes it easier to conduct the study. However, is this a strong clinical or scientific merit if this is a disease that is prevalent across the cultures, in which case it would not be. So these are some things that we want to kind of talk about is, are these exclusion criteria really have a purpose, or are they just an easy way to go about enrolling in your study? So really looking at those eligibility criteria, that how do they have a goal of a realistic representation of the patient population? And are they to exclude those with underlying medical issues, which could increase adverse events, such as kidney problems, as far as clearance of the drug in question? Also consider the phase of the clinical trial. Often there's a much more narrow inclusion exclusion in your phase 1 and 2, um, because you are really trying to see what type of adverse events are there. But just don't copy those over into your later phases, because that may not be something that is justifiable. Excuse me, I'm having throat issues this morning. Are ever rampant allergens. And you want to enroll subjects that represent the characteristics of the clinically relevant populations with regard to age, sex, race, and ethnicity. Um, Sometimes being able to include some of the more vulnerable populations in later trials, such as the pediatrics or those with some type of impairment, is also suggested, or racial or ethnic minorities to examine genetic or metabolic differences. This is something that has also um, been brought forward, that there are inherent differences genetically and metabolically between the different races and ethnicities. Include data analysis on race and ethnicity no later than the end of phase 2 studies. So, what they're suggesting is that in your study design, that you plan to do an analysis breaking down study results on race, based on race and ethnicity, no later than the end of the phase 2 study, so that you would be able to capture any differences that may not exist between the populations. So also consider some various trial designs and methods. As you know, we have been discussing various designs to increase enrollment, as well as to increase compliance with study requirements. So there again, consider how best to characterize metabolic and clearance data to increase the ability to broaden enrollment in later phases. So again, they're saying that during your initial phases and your analysis, look at some of those instances that may be across ethnicities and different racial populations. How the study drug is metabolized by the system, as well as how it is cleared through the system. Is it unique among those that are in the study, or is there some differences? Maybe you can account for what those differences are. Use of an adaptive study design to adjust enrollment to include a more diverse group later on in the study. So you might start with a very smaller, diverse group, and then add others to it with time as the study goes on. Um, so, as most of you may be aware, when their sponsors are doing clinical drug trials, they often start with the adult population. If it is something that occurs in pediatrics, then they work their way down. Currently, with the COVID virus, they're including those in the adolescent ages, 12 to 18. I think I saw that there even have some that are doing like the 5 to 11 now, and they basically work their way down. This was something 20 years ago that was an issue with pediatric medicine, in that a lot of times the pediatric trials are more costly due to decreasing your risk factors. And so a lot of the sponsors would not do the clinical trials for the pediatric populations. And if those medications were used in the pediatric populations, they had to be written off label. So consider how you're going to include all populations that are applicable for this disease in your initial study design. Using the adaptive study, you might go ahead and say in your phase 2 trial that at a 6-month interim analysis, you might decide if it's still doing well, that you may um, open your enrollment to different age groups, is what they're talking about for the adaptive study design. So rather than using the staggering enrollment based just on chronic age, is that really required, or can you include them in the initial study? Consider again pharmacokinetic sampling in women who become pregnant during a trial. Again, this would be based on the fact that you did some of the characteristic metabolic and clearance data early on to understand how that drug is metabolized by the system. Again, these are all things that do increase some of your risks, but if you do your due diligence at the beginning of the study and looking at some of these things, that would counteract that. They also talked about in the document the use of enrichment strategies to your trial design. One of these is considering enrollment of subjects across the fuller spectrum of the disease severity. So, for instance, they gave the example of a cardiac disease, that you limit the severity of the disease. They have to have at least a functioning of, let's say, an ejection fraction of a certain amount, so that you didn't get the ones that were probably, going to have issues. But to go ahead and include those so that you have a better understanding of how this drug would work across the spectrum of diseases, not just this very minor population that has very limited disease. Um, Use of various study endpoints at different time intervals, so that you might enroll in a cardiac study with a cardiac drug, um, but then at a later date, add those that have a fuller spectrum of the disease, and add an endpoint, an additional study endpoint later in the trial, rather than starting a full new study. This saves time with some of your IRB reviews if all of that is reviewed at the beginning. And it also increases your ability to enroll from a diverse population. Um, and you might provide more efficacy information for broader populations as you design your study. So, again, in looking at your study designs, are there ways that you can enhance the study population to be more reflective of the actual patient population for that disease? Other considerations that you can use um, for increasing the diversity of your clinical trial population is to decrease the burden of participation. This is something that, again, during the time that you're designing your study, um, can you decrease the travel by the number of site visits that the patient has to make? These are some of the things that we've actually had to um, start using during the pandemic for different reasons. It was because they couldn't come, But we've seen that some of these methods have actually increased our participation in some of the studies because the patients didn't have to come, every single month to the study site. They could conduct, maybe every third visit be at the study site, um, the others being conducted through telemedicine. Use of local primary care physicians. Do they have to come all the way in a 2-hour drive to get a blood draw? That can be done at their local primary care physician's office, and those samples being sent to a central lab. Uh, Again, this is time saving, it's money saving, um, and it increases the possibilities that they would enroll in a trial. I know that for pediatric studies, especially for adolescents, those were things that we really had to consider in that how many times are you going to have to pull that child out of school? And how many times does that parent have to take off work in order to bring their child to a visit? And that's why sometimes in pediatric studies, we do more of the after hours, late into the evening, or on weekend for our study visits in order to reduce the number of times the children have to miss due to a research study, especially if they're already missing school due to the disease of study. Um, Educate subjects on study approved financial reimbursements for travel or food or whatever, those things that the study sponsor is willing to reimburse for. FDA and NIH both say that travel is reimbursable. It is not considered coercive to reimbursement for their travel and those types of expenses. So again, making sure that the subjects know, and sometimes you have to kind of remind them, just as um, when uh, we were traveling, we're not traveling now, but if we were traveling to uh, conferences and things like that, how often has the administrative aide had to remind you to put in your receipt so you can be reimbursed? So again, making sure that you work with your uh, subjects to make sure that they're receiving those financial reimbursements. Using patient focused advocacy groups. This is especially important if you're looking at some of the rare diseases. Um, they face a number of barriers and challenges on a daily basis that you might not be aware of. When I was working in the pediatric trials, one of the first things that I did when given a new trial was to better understand what those challenges and barriers were that that individual had to face, not just that individual, but their family. Um, so, better understanding those and working something into the study design that will help to compensate for that in some ways is going to increase your enrollment. So, those are things that you really want to look at um, as far as helping, assisting with determining the risk benefit ratios of enrollment. What is the subject willing to do? Um, I think this is something that has really been paramount and within the last 10 years of seeking out these advocacy groups to find out what is a patient willing to put up with. I've seen some trials where it looks like they went into a grocery store and more or less said, we'll do this, 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 and this. And as a coordinator, you've looked at that and said, for pediatrics, what parent's going to put their child through that just to be in a study? Um, so again, really looking at those things, those study procedures, is it really necessary that they do that at every single visit? Or is it something you can do once a year? Um, what are the things, how do they feel about enrolling in these studies? If your enrollment is not high, start asking why. What is it that you're doing? Can it be in the approach? Um, I worked with a colleague and they were not being able to enroll a series of infants into a study. And so I asked her, I said, well, explain to me what your approach is. Well, she was not a mother and nothing wrong with that. But when she gave me her how she would try to enroll, I was like, well, as a mom, I would say no to that study too. So we discussed, how a mother might feel about taking a newborn and enrolling them in a study, and how you might be able to answer those fears um, at the time of enrollment. So again, understanding that patient population that you're targeting, and then also try to understand it in a broad spectrum um, is helpful. Use of community engagement groups. Within the Center for Clinical and Translational Science, we actually have someone who specifically addresses this and helps reach some of these community groups to overcome the trust issues and research misunderstandings. There are a lot of populations out there that are health illiterate, in the sense that they do not understand health and the consequences of it, of what is the purpose of all of these blood trials. Well, you're watching how the blood is absorbs the medication and then gets rid of it. They see it as over, just wanting to stick people more. So these are things that you have to overcome when trying to enroll these diverse populations. What are their fears? What are their mistrusts? Do they properly understand the purpose of clinical trials? That again was very prominent in the news over during the pandemic, that there were a lot that didn't understand the purpose of a clinical trial and the way that we go about conducting these clinical trials to protect patients and but also produce robust data. So use of community engagement groups helps improve that bidirectional communication and enhances the community support of that clinical trial. Some other considerations is to increase the diversity of our workforce so that we can better meet the cultural needs of these study populations. Having a coordinator that can speak Spanish, we've already seen that that's very beneficial in certain areas. Here within Central Ohio, we know that we have a very high Somali population. Having a coordinator that can speak Somali or those different ones. And it's not just the ability to speak their language, but to understand their culture. There are various resources out there that can help you to understand some of those cultures. So if you're trying to recruit to a more diverse population, learn something about the culture, understand some of their fears. Uh, I One of the examples that always comes to mind when I'm talking about the cultural differences and how they can affect someone, I remember a principal investigator that was hired, um, and I was talking to him one day. Very nice gentleman, very very pleasant. And I handed him something, and he got this look on his face, and then it disappeared. And so I asked him, "So what's wrong?" And I had handed him something using my left hand. And he explained to me that in the country that he came from, that was considered the dirty hand and that it was considered an insult. Now, he realized quickly, even though he realized I was handing with the left hand and that in his country that would have been considered an insult, that he knew I didn't realize that because it was not a cultural difference in the United States. He explained it, and I made the effort in the future to always hand him whatever I was handing him with the right hand. These are small, small issues that can prevent you from enrolling a subject unknown to both parties. Why are they handing me that with that hand? And you're unknowingly doing it because you're not aware of that cultural um, discrepancy. So learn your populations. It's so important. Including evening and weekend hours for recruitment purposes, holding the recruitment events in local locations. I know that for one of our studies, when we were looking at a vaccine for otitis media or ear infections. We went down to COSI and up on the top floor where there were little children, that run around doing things. We approached the families there. COSI gave us the permission, and we would say, we're doing a study, and, would they like to enroll? There was a little room off the area where we could then take them in, sign consent, take the sample, and that was it. It was just a collecting of those samples. Um, Summer camps. In the past, there's been, a diabetes camp. We would used to go to those when enrolling for diabetic studies. A lot of these were your initial studies where you're gathering biomarkers or things like that. Going to community centers. If you're looking at enrollment, go to those centers, meet them where they are comfortable. There are a lot of individuals when they come to a big facility like Ohio State or Nationwide Children's or just to a big city that they can become very scared, and it's an environment that you don't feel comfortable in. If you go to their communities, you can increase your population enrollment. Being able to include various languages in the information that you provide. If there's a sheet that explains a procedure, have it translated into the various languages of the populations that you were approaching. I know at Children's we had handouts in various languages about some of the more normal procedures that could be used, such as an MRI or blood draws or, typical procedures, an echo, and it would be translated into various languages so that you could hand the patient's family a document in their language explaining what they were going to do and things like that. That really will increase your ability to reach those multicultural populations. Also, the use of online and social media recruitment strategies. Again, the CCTS does have some individuals who work on that specifically. It does increase your enrollment because it does increase your ability to get that information out to the various populations. And then the use of the electronic informed consent practices. Prior to the pandemic, that was one of the procedures that was kind of debated as to how to do it and making it fair and justice and meet all the regulatory requirements that were in the regulations. I think that the pandemic has been helpful in pushing that forward of ways ways to do that in a regulatory fashion that satisfies the IRB. Actually, later this year, I want to do a presentation or have someone on do a presentation around the use of electronic informed consent practice and some of the things that need to be considered when trying to use that, because there are some considerations that need to be made. When looking at rare diseases or those conditions where your overall population is very small to begin with. So, those diseases that have a fairly rare incidence in the population, some of them in the when in pediatrics, you might only have one or two at your site. And that's where the multi trials came in, is multi-site trials. You might need to enroll in 10 different sites in order to meet the needs of what you need to power the study. So there are some different things that you might need to think about. A lot of trials, if a patient has been enrolled in a study in an earlier phase, they're not allowed to enroll in a later phase. Make sure that that is something that is scientifically justified as opposed to just trying to keep the data cleaner. I think that there are ways that our biostatisticians can compensate for that. Use of crossover trials or open label extensions are other ways that you can keep that larger population enrolled when the original is very small to begin with. Um, one of the things that was apparent when you're dealing with some of these very rare diseases is that you sometimes have to enroll from a distance. So some of our pediatric trials, because we do have a lot of rare diseases there that occur at in the pediatric ages, they could be coming from as far away as California on a monthly basis. And so use of a travel coordinator um, or concierge, if you want to call them that, was very helpful that that person was doing all of the travel arrangements and compensations as opposed to the clinical coordinator. It kept things separate somewhat. And sometimes it was required because we had a study that there were only 6 patients enrolled, but they came from all over the country, but they were ones in wheelchairs. And it was very difficult with the flight arrangements of because certain wheelchairs, powered wheelchairs, were not allowed on the planes. And so there were a lot of things that needed to be worked out. Excuse me a moment. That using a travel coordinator really helped with that. For that one, we were also putting them up in a hotel and making those arrangements and all. It really was almost its own job. It was actually. So, resources. I've talked about a couple of them. Here is one that is later this month. It is put on by our Recruitment and Retention Office with the CCTS, and they're going to be presenting some information about engagement and recruitment, looking at the experience in Southeast Ohio, the Appalachian area. Again, while this may not be a population that you're enrolling from, listening to this presentation helps you to think beyond the normal templates and copycat enrollment, inclusions, exclusion criteria, and the importance of networking and building those relationships with the community. These will be sent out later today, all of these slides, and this will give you a registration link as it's indicated over there. And if you have questions or can't register, just let me know and I'll put you in contact with our Recruitment and Retention Office. Another resource that I located was from our Harvard, the Clinical Trial Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital. This is about a 300-page guide that talks about diversity and inclusion and equity in the clinical research domain. And you can easily download it. You don't have to print it all out. And it kind of goes into some of the things that I've been talking about, but there is an associated toolkit that can be helpful if you're trying to reach that very diverse population and to meet those FDA suggestions, not requirements, but suggestions. And here are some additional resources that I found for some others, that some of them have toolkits also included, NIH workforce diversity. So that is in addition, as I alluded earlier, that it is not just the populations that we need to be looking to diversify and to be more inclusive and to be more representative of the patient population. But we also need to diversify in our workforce. Often, those of a different culture would prefer to see a physician that understands their culture and speaks their language. just as there are some who prefer to see a physician of the same gender that they are. Makes it easier to discuss things. So we need to diversify those that we are in the workforce, as well as those that are our scientists, and making sure that they are representative of the population and not just the ones that everyone accepts. So again, these are some of the resources that I was able to identify and some that were sent to me. Again, this will be released, will be sent out following the presentation today, and these are all links that you can go on. Some additional resources that I used. The first reference is the actual guidance itself that they issued. And the second is the Belmont report, which I refer to all the time. I think I have that one on speed dial. So I wanted to thank everybody for their attendance today. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put some of them in the chat if you have a specific question right now, because we do have about 15 minutes left. If you have a specific question, or you can always send me a question. Again, if you're looking to diversify as far as populations, there are resources within the CCTS that can assist you with that. So feel free to reach out and I can put you in contact with those individuals. We do have a statement from Karen White. Are there financial resources that the university for consent form translations when investigators do not have funding for expense translations? That I don't know. However, making sure that you have the use of a short form, that is a form that at least explains research, is something that you need to be doing. And it could be that there are various grants, small grants that you might be able to tag for that. I'll make a note of that and try to get back with everybody as far as what that might be, because that is a good question. Sometimes these consent forms are quite lengthy. I know that we had some that we had to translate into various languages for a genetic study. Again, that could also be something that you might reach out to a study sponsor on as to whether or not they would be willing to cover the cost of the consents. And we do have at Ohio State many language departments that might also be willing to help. So I will look into that and see if I can find an answer for you and a resource to answer that question. I know that you could always go on Google and they can translate it for you, but I don't think that would really be good, because I don't know that they would be able to do the medical terminology, and whether or not someone would still have to be able to approve it. So that's a very good question. Any other questions? And I will send that once I find some answers for you, Katie. I will send that out to everybody so that everybody has the answers to that. Some additional things that I wanted to kind of bring to your attention. I know that we had earlier talked in the beginning of the year about setting up some study groups and also some workshops. I apologize. The beginning of this year, health-wise, was a little stressful. I have recovered, although my voice doesn't sound like that. So I will be sending out some information. Since they have also opened up the use of some of the rooms for 10 and under, I am going to approach SOCRA about another on-site study or exam. I know that in the past they wanted at least 15 or 16, but they might be willing to come for the maximum of 10. if that is our requirement. So I'm going to look into that. Uh, Thank you, Daisy. Daisy from our compliance team in the Office of Research, College of Medicine, says for sponsored studies, translational fees can be included in your study budget. So that's, again, is an area where you might be able to seek some of that translational needs. But I am going to be sending out some information about the testing and some study groups, probably this is Thursday, by tomorrow, and get that started. The other thing that we're going to start the initial workings on is some mentoring. And I'll have some emails probably next week on what we kind of want to do along those lines for mentoring, both at an initial level and then on a more advanced level. Again, I encourage you to send me with needs. If there is a study, an area that you would like to see presented, please let me know. I know that we're constantly changing the way that we conduct our clinical trials due to the pandemic. So if there are issues, let me know and I will try to find answers for you. And with that, if there's no more questions, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question because you don't like typing or you're on the phone, go ahead. I will stay on until 10 o'clock. So be open to questions, even if they don't have anything to do with today's presentation. Feel free. This is your time. And I will drink some more water. Thanks, everyone.